If you're someone who's trying to look for advice on how to read more, but feels very intimidated getting advice from people who've read, say, 100 or 150 books in the last year, look no farther. This video is for you. I do not by any means claim to be an avid reader. I want to read more and more, but I still have a lot of progress I need to make. But over the last 2.5 years or a little more, I went from a person who didn't read any books, hardly at all, to a person who at least does read and listen to books. And I don't even know if I'd consider myself to an intermediate level of reading. I'd still say I'm in many ways a beginner. So this is a video from a beginner to extreme beginners. So this video is for like extreme beginners. It's like extreme beginners. Like no one has made a video for such extreme beginners. I am the first. It is very scary, but someone's gotta do it. Dream guest on my podcast? Oh my gosh. Honestly, my rabbits. Anyway, back to the video. So here are 10 tips that I found helpful. Tip 1, listen to audiobooks. Now, do audiobooks count as reading? Yes, they do. Listening to audiobooks has many of the same benefits as reading physical books. I tend to prefer listening to audiobooks, especially for fiction. Like, if I'm honest, most of the books I've read in the last 2.5 years have been audiobooks. I just find it easier and more enjoyable. I just tend to find listening to an audiobook more relaxing than reading a physical book. Obviously with audiobooks it's easier to multitask, which may or may not be a good thing, but honestly even aside from that, like I've just many times just like laid on the couch and listened to an audiobook as I might watch a movie or TV show. So if you're trying to get back into reading or get into reading for the first time, I would highly suggest giving audiobooks a shot. Now, if you're a really fast reader who really enjoys reading physical books or ebooks, of course, you don't have to listen to audiobooks, but I find audiobooks have been a really great way to get back into reading, and I find that actually listening to audiobooks makes it easier to then read physical books. Like I'm somehow kind of in like the reading mindset or the story mindset or something like that. Tip 2, read or listen to multiple books at once. Now for me, I almost feel like I go too far in this direction, that I start too many books and then don't finish them. But if you're someone who feels like you can only read or only listen to one book at once, I would encourage you to read at least 2 or 3 books, because I'm sure you're interested in more than just like one genre of book. I'm sure you probably have interest in certain fiction and nonfiction books, or even if you don't, certain genres within fiction or nonfiction. So often you might be in the mood for reading, but not reading a particular book or genre. Again, it might be different times of the day, different days of the week, just your energy levels, all that. Just so it's best not to shoehorn yourself into one book, or else you might not be in the mood for reading that one book and not read at all, when you might be in the mood for reading and be able to read another book. Tip 3, talk to people who also like to read. I found that talking to people who also like to read has helped me with motivating and inspiring me to read. Now, I'm not necessarily saying you have to go out and join a book club. I'm just saying if you come across people in your daily life who like to read, or the conversation goes to reading, you find that they like to read, it can be helpful to talk, because you might find there's a shared overlap of books or genres of books that you both like, so you can recommend each other books. I've just found that just being around people who like to read and somewhat frequently read just helps read more. It just kind of gets you into that zone as like that's an option of things you can do. Tip 4, go to the library. Again, I find that just going to a library can help put you in kind of the reading mindset. Of course, there are lots of options when it comes to books and audiobooks, so you can check them out. Of course, then you have to actually read or listen to them. But there's something about a library space that I feel like just encourages you to want to read more. And it's nice where you can just like check something out, where it's not like you have to buy something. So it's not like you've bought something. So I just find going and browsing at a library and seeing the books, audiobooks, other stuff, it just can help nudge you in the direction of wanting to read more and having that motivation to read more. Tip 5, set page limits on how much you want to read. Now in this video, I haven't given a lot of advice on like the specifics of like when you read, because I honestly haven't found a lot of that advice very helpful. But one piece of advice I've found helpful is to focus on page numbers rather than time read. I often hear advice about, oh, you should set a timer, but honestly, I feel like I just will like keep rereading the same sentence or paragraph. I feel like setting a timer just makes, I almost feel like I'll read less than if I hadn't. But I find that setting goals when it comes to how many pages you want to read is a lot more helpful. Or often it's maybe with chapters or with sections of chapters, depending how long it is. But I found, and again, this is more applicable to actually reading books rather than audiobooks, but I found that saying like, oh, I want to read so many pages, I tend to find that's a lot more helpful than setting a time limit, because I feel like I'm a pretty slow reader, or it's like set the timer for 15 minutes, where it's like I feel like I won't have read that much. Where I feel like saying I want to read this many pages or this chapter, those I tend to find I'm better at actually doing it and making progress and completing something. Tip 6, read nonfiction books. This is something I found throughout my life in periods where I haven't read a lot and then I start reading again, is nonfiction books are a great way to get into reading, or nonfiction books are a great way to get back into reading. There's something about fiction books that I find harder to get into, especially when we're talking about like reading a book rather than an audiobook. Like I worry I'm not going to be properly enjoying it or just getting in, but with getting into getting into the story correctly. But with nonfiction, I feel like you can just read it, get the information. You can get into it easier and get the information. It's more similar to like reading an article online. So I find nonfiction books are a great introduction in getting into reading again. Nonfiction is a lot bigger than just like self-help or motivation or self-improvement. Not saying you can't read that as nonfiction, but don't limit yourself to that. If you have some other interests, pick up a nonfiction book that falls under those interests. Tip 7, read mystery books. I feel like mystery books are great for beginner readers. One of the first or second book I read when I was getting back into reading was a mystery book, or technically I listened to it. So I find that mystery books are a really great way when you're starting. To read again, because you want to know what's going to happen next. It's kind of built into the book. With other books, they might be really good, but especially if you're new to reading or haven't read in a long time, it might be harder to stick with them. But with mysteries, especially if there's like a lot of like stuff happening, you're like, I have to know what's going to happen next. I have to know how it's all going to turn out. So I feel like mysteries are a great choice when you're trying to get back into reading. If they're decently enough written, they kind of have it built in to them, stuff to keep you interested and stick it out to the end. Tip 8, read children's books. Now these can be books you read or listened to as a child, or they can be children's books you haven't read or listened to before. The thing about children's books is they tend to be relatively short, so I feel like that's a way you can listen to more books. I don't necessarily like the idea of like choosing easy books just so you can like hit an arbitrary number of books, but I find it can give you extra motivation to be like, I've read such and such number of books, and if you choose shorter books, that can help you get to that point where you feel more motivated. And I feel like children's books, tend to be pretty easy to get into. They're usually relatively simple. It can be nice to just listen to something that's easy listening, especially when you're a beginner, that isn't like super deep or complex. Not to say children's books can't be deep and complex, but in a different sort of way. There can also be something nice and nostalgic about going back to a familiar book that you liked as a child, but it can also be kind of exciting to listen to a new book or series of books that maybe were around when you were a child, maybe even are really old, but you never listened to, maybe even you weren't familiar with them. So it can definitely be a nice experience. Tip 9. Don't be afraid to not finish a book. Especially when you're a beginner, if a book isn't grabbing you pretty soon, I'd say just stop it, at least for now. Now, here's the thing. I think it's helpful to think of it as like, I'm not necessarily not ever going to read or listen to this book, but not right now. It's not capturing my interest soon enough. Again, how long into reading or listening to a book that is somewhat up for you to decide. For me, I can kind of just tell relatively quickly. There's not like a set time, but so it's helpful for me. It's not like, oh, I'll never read this book, but not right now. So I find that's a helpful mindset. It's not like you have to feel bad. Of course, maybe a book, it's just like totally not at all what you had in mind and you're not necessarily interested. But some books you might be like, maybe at some later date I will be interested in it, but just not right now. So giving yourself permission to do that and not feeling like you have to stick with any book, even if you only read one page of it or something. Just be like, I don't have to finish it or get far into it now, maybe at some later date, but not right now. That's a mindset that I found helpful. Tip 10, don't be too hard on yourself. Finally, this is something that I think needs to be said. It's so easy to look at people who read 100 or 150 books a year, or even 50 books a year, like a book a week, and be like, that's so beyond what I'm capable of, at least right now. But realize it's okay. You're doing what you can. You're trying to make progress in the ways that you want to make it. You're trying to make progress in the ways that you want to and are capable of. So just realize it's about trying to improve just a little bit every day and every week. Just try and get 1% better. So focus on the intrinsic enjoyment you find from it, not towards reaching some arbitrary goal of however many books you've read, or feeling like you just gotta read even if you don't enjoy it. Just focus on enjoying it. Just focus on enjoying reading and being in the moment. So those are my 10 tips from a beginner reader to extreme beginner readers. So I hope you found it helpful, and I hope, coming from me, who is certainly not an advanced reader, and I wouldn't even consider an intermediate reader, I hope it's less intimidating coming from a fellow beginner reader, just maybe not as extreme of a beginner reader. So, are there any other suggestions that you as a beginner reader have found helpful to read more? Comment those below. And until next time, keep your chin up.